All right, guys, today we're going to be talking about Charlemagne. So, when we left off last time, we were talking about the end of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Byzantine Empire. And if you recall, towards the end of the Roman Empire, we would have a couple of emperors that would separate the empire and break it into an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire, which would then be reunited under Constantine. And then after that, when the Roman Empire falls, the Eastern Empire will still stay intact, and that'll become the Byzantine Empire. So the question that we're going to answer today is what happens to the rest of the world that once existed under the regular Roman Empire? And so that's kind of where we're going to head today. So what we're now headed into is what's known as the Middle Ages. And so primarily we're talking about a time between about 476 AD, which we of course know as the fall of the Roman Empire, and about 1400. So a period of around 1,000 years. Now there's going to be a whole lot of stuff going on here, and at one time historians used to call this the Dark Ages. We don't call it really that anymore because we now know that there was a lot of things going on actually during the Dark Ages. Things weren't entirely dark as was once assumed. And so it was once believed that during this time, the Middle Ages, historians used to say, well, nothing went on. We stopped learning how to read and write, and so consequently, all knowledge was lost, and things sort of disappeared. And well, that's not true. In fact, we know that there are several smaller renaissances that take place during the Middle Ages that will kind of lead to the major renaissance that we'll talk about in a couple of units that takes place that really kind of revolutionizes art and writing and literature and things like that in Europe. But anyway, we're going to start talking today about the Middle Ages. And primarily, when we talk about the Middle Ages, we can't leave out what is the Middle Ages. Okay, so from about 500 to about 1500, the Middle Ages was a society with roots in the cultures of Rome, in the religion of the church, and in Germanic tribes. Okay, so that's the big three pieces that influence the Middle Ages. And we got what's left of the Roman Empire that really has a lot to do with what a lot of people living in the Middle Ages, how they behaved, what they did. That was all left over from Rome. But then you also have this piece of the church, and we cannot separate talking about the Middle Ages with European history and the church. I mean, they're intertwined completely inseparably. Like, you cannot separate those things. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church becomes such an integral and important part of most people's lives during the Middle Ages and even later, that a lot of the topics that we talk about from this unit on will deal with the church. And that's one of the reasons why last semester I gave you guys the structure of the church, so that you would know when we talk about the church, which we will repeatedly, you will know what we're talking about. Okay, so then the other piece of this whole Middle Ages thing is these Germanic tribes. Now that's going to come into play here in a minute when we talk about a lot of these Germanic tribes didn't really put a huge emphasis on education. And because they didn't put an emphasis on education, they didn't put an emphasis on reading and writing. And so that's where this idea that people just kind of forgot how to read and write came from. Now, obviously, people don't forget how to read and write. It doesn't just go away. But after a couple of generations, when you're influenced by a group of people that doesn't put the same emphasis on reading and writing as you do, that don't have a written language, eventually with intermingling and interbreeding, you'll see that the people there don't have that emphasis on reading and writing anymore. And that's exactly what happens with the Middle Ages. Okay, so we are talking about invasions of Western Europe. So Roman Empire has fallen. This is kind of, I know it's not a great picture, but it kind of gives you an idea of a timeline, kind of what we're talking about here. Let me get my laser going. So if you look, we're primarily focusing today right in kind of this area right here. Okay. So from about 580 to about 980. That's primarily the area we're focusing on today. As we continue on, we'll talk about people like William the Conqueror. We'll talk about the Crusades. We'll talk about the Concordat of Worms. That's a pretty big part of history there. And then we will talk about Constantinople following the Ottoman Turks. We already kind of talked about that a little bit last semester too. But as we go on here, we'll talk about how the Crusades and Constantinople are kind of interrelated. But anyway, today we're going to primarily focus on Charlemagne and what could be considered the end of the Roman Empire. And if you look, by 500 AD, Germanic tribes are going to control most of Europe. Now that's only about 24 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. So 476 AD, we have 500 AD. So within that 24 years, Germanic tribes are going to completely wipe out all of the vestiges of the Roman Empire, and they will end up controlling most of Europe. Now, that out of those Germanic tribes is where we're going to see one of the most prominent and probably important rulers to come out of Europe. His name was Charlemagne. We'll talk about him here in a few minutes. But one of the big pieces of the Germanic tribes that are going to invade Rome and take over most of Europe is that these Germanic invaders did not really have a written language. Okay? And because they didn't have a written language, they didn't have the Roman emphasis on education, and because they didn't have the Roman emphasis on education, they really kind of stopped caring about education. So as they took over the Roman, what was once the Roman Empire, and began to move closer and closer and closer to Rome, eventually what you'd see is that these Germanic invaders would, like I said, intermingle with people. They would intermarry. They would begin having children. And because the invaders of the Roman Empire didn't care about education, they didn't demand that their kids were educated. And so consequently, after 2 or 3 generations, people simply didn't have the education base to know how to write or read. And so consequently, that's really kind of how reading and writing sort of disappeared from Europe. Now, I also want to point out that reading and writing didn't actually disappear from Europe. That never actually happened, because one group of people that was always reading and writing were monks and priests, because it was their job to try to push Christianity on people, to introduce Christianity to people. And so because of that, they needed to be able to read and write, because they were supposed to be able to read and write Bibles. That was their primary job. Now, we'll talk a little bit later on what some problems that happen in the church in which many priests are not reading and writing. And so the people began to question, well, if you can't read and you can't write, how could you possibly teach us what's in the Bible? So, but we'll talk about that a little later. So, reading and writing never really disappears from Europe. There will be people still reading and writing between 500 and 1500 AD. But by and large, most common people couldn't read and write. And that was just, like I said, the emphasis had gone away. All right, so the primary language that people were using, if you could read and write, were 2 languages, Greek and Latin. Now, primarily, and if you look right here on this map I've got you, this is all the Germanic tribes. We've got Odoacer, who we talked about before. We got the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths are down here, and you've got all these different tribes, the Saxons, the Anglos, and they will wind up kind of separating themselves and living in these Germanic tribes, but still at the same time within Rome itself, or what was left of Rome, and within the Byzantine Empire, which is over here, Greek and Latin would still be primarily spoken. By the 800s, though, we have different languages. Now, these aren't written languages yet. These are simply spoken languages. We'll see the development of languages like French and Spanish and English. And so if you look, we've got these West Germanic languages, and they sort of began to separate into these various different languages. You have Old English, Middle English, English, Frisian, you've got Low German, Middle German, you've got Dutch, Afrikaans, which is spoken in Africa today, but it's a derivative of Dutch. You've got regular German, you've got Yiddish. Now, primarily, if you guys are familiar at all with English, and you should have, I know that Mrs. Haydenfeld usually teaches this, but Shakespeare, when he was writing, he was actually writing in really early modern English, which is, an English we don't really use anymore. If you were to go back in time and actually look at Old English, you would certainly not recognize it. I mean, it's nothing like modern English. But anyway, that's where we derive our modern English. But regardless, by the 800s, those major languages are in existence. They exist. And so because of the different separations between these Germanic tribes, we will also see Germanic tribes that will form different types of government. Now, typically, these Germanic tribes were all about clans and clan leaders. There was typically a tribe chief. There was no king over all these groups, and that tribe chief would switch with generations. There weren't really dynasties established. They would just sort of switch as things went on. So, out of that group, we would see a group called the Franks, out of these different Germanic tribes who were living in Gaul. And that's also where we get France from, the term France. And they were led by one guy by the name of Clovis. Now, Clovis would convert to Christianity because of his wife. Her name was Clothilda. And so Clovis decides he's going to become a Christian because Clothilda was a Christian. I mean, I'm sure that the intermarital relationship helped to sway him in his opinion on Christianity. But as many of these things go, when we're talking about Europe and we're talking about the development of different countries, whenever the king becomes something, like if the king becomes Christian, pretty much everybody else has to too. I mean, it's not really optional. And so it wasn't any different with Clovis. When Clovis became a Christian, he said, all right, now everybody in my tribe, you all are Christians. And if you don't like it, well, here's a sword and I'll chop your head off. So it was a bit not by choice oftentimes. So anyway, we begin to see Germans under Clovis begin to convert to Christianity. And like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of options. I mean, Clovis said, I'm a Christian, so you all have to be too. And so everybody just simply had to become Christian. If you look right here, this is a painting showing the baptism of Clovis. Here's Clovis right here being baptized. And so that was pretty important, though, because like I said, Christianity plays a huge part in our understanding of Western Civ and the development of Western Civ. By 600 then, most of Europe had become Roman Catholic. And so out of these various parts of Europe, we would see a lot of new religious communities called monasteries. And these monasteries were primarily held for men, and they were men who were interested in basically what was called pursuing the cloth. In other words, you wanted to be a priest or you wanted to devote your life to Christianity. And so all across Europe, we'd see a lot of monasteries. Now, that doesn't seem like offhand a big deal, except for the fact that many of these monasteries would end up being the driving force of education in the Western European setting. I mean, a lot of these monasteries were primarily devoted to education. And so consequently, it would be these monasteries that would drive new learning within Europe. And that was a pretty big deal because as Europeans and monasteries begin to kind of intertwine, we would see a lot of new learning going on. And keep in mind, it was these monasteries that were the ones that were producing books in Europe. There wasn't commercial printing presses or anything yet. And so if you wanted a book, you had to go to a monastery to get it because that's what monks did. They'd get up in the morning, they'd say their morning prayers, maybe sing a few songs, and then they would sit down and spend the whole day copying books down. It was a very labor-intensive thing. I mean, if you wanted to copy a book, you had to write down each and every page. So it was largely the responsibility of monks at monasteries that were copying the Bible, in essence. And sometimes they would translate into different languages, but most of the time it was in Latin. And they had to spend their day copying down a book. Okay? So monks as well, they would give up their worldly possessions and devote their entire lives to God. That was what they were all about. Now, if you look, here's a kind of a stereotypical monk for the Middle Ages. And then, of course, over here is a stereotypical nun. We'll talk about nuns, too. Now, monks lived in monasteries. And so this is one of the early monasteries that you can see here. surrounded by sort of an early castle type wall. Nuns lived in convents.